Hi everyone, we will continue our search for truth home Bible studies with lesson 5, chart 1. Alright, so for lesson 5, we've come to a transition, right, of the Israelites having spent time wandering in the desert for 40 years as a result of their disobedience, right? So lesson 5, chart 1 talks about how after these 40 years have come to an end, God is bringing the Israelites into Canaan, into the land of promise that he had all along wanted to do for them. Right. So towards just before they enter the promised land, we talk about a few key events. Right. One will be the death of Moses. Right. So the Bible said that Moses didn't get a chance to cross into the promised land. Instead, he died in the desert. Right. And at that point, or rather, there is a succession, right, of leadership for the Israelites. Right. So Moses, after leading the Israelites for 40 years, died in the desert, and his leadership was passed on to Joshua. Right, he was chosen to lead the people into the promised land. Now, as that happened, God assured Joshua that he will be with Joshua just as he was with Moses. Right, and these are the things that God said to Joshua. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you just as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you. And God continues to elaborate how Joshua can stay close to the Lord. He says, study this book of instruction continually, which is basically the Bible. Meditate on it day and night, so you will be sure to obey everything written in it. Only then will you prosper and succeed in all that you do. So basically, God is issuing a call to Joshua to obey God and worship God, right, for himself, rather than rely on the fact that Moses worshiped God. Right. So with this command, with this instruction, Joshua began to prepare to lead the people. Right. Now, and as Joshua did that, basically he reminded the Israelites that no, God will bless them because of his promises that he has made to the Israelites' forefathers. Right. So it was interesting that as they reached the Jordan River, in fact, the Bible describes that that particular season where they were crossing the Jordan River, the waters were particularly full. The river, the water levels were actually higher than normal. Right. So, but as they went there, right, the waters parted and they crossed the river on dry ground. Right. And once they did that, right, the Israelites left a memorial of stones, right, within the river itself, right, to commemorate that God had stopped the river. So I thought it was interesting that when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt into the desert to bring them to the next phase of his promise with them, right, he opened the Red Sea, a miracle happened. Now, as God is leading the Israelites from the desert into the promised land, again, another body of water was miraculously stopped, another miracle happened. So it's almost as if God is saying that I will be with you. For me, I will always be with you, right? And I will demonstrate it by the miraculous. Now, and when this happened, we read of this situation when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings who lived along the Mediterranean coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan River so that people of Israel could cross. They lost heart and were paralyzed with fear because of them. So God demonstrated his reality. God demonstrated that he was with his people through signs and wonders. Now, the Israelites spent the next many years conquering this promised land. Right. Now, but before they continue, after crossing the river, once they crossed the river, before they continue on their conquest, right, the Bible says that the men circumcised themselves, right, and it tells us basically that during the 40 years of wilderness, right, the Israelites didn't practice circumcision. Now, this act of circumcision again underlies the importance of what the Israelites understood to be the sign of the covenant between them and God. Right, that circumcision is that important that they must do what it is to honor the Lord, right, as an act of being in relationship with God. Right, and in the rest of the book of Joshua, we read about how God led the Israelites to different kinds of miraculous victories. For example, one of it included God making the sun stand still. Rather, the sun didn't set, meaning time stood still, so that Joshua could complete his battles. Right? So these are just some examples of how God has led them through different kinds of victories that only God can do, not of men. Right. And all in all, Joshua and the Israelites defeated 31 kings in the land of Canaan. So bear in mind, these are a group of a community or a group of people whose background for many years were basically as slaves, right? People who are not versed in the art of warfare or the military, so on and so forth. But God has allowed them to defeat that many kings, right? And when we look at this verse here, Joshua 21:43, so the Lord gave to Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. Not a single one of all the good promises the Lord had given to the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. Everything he had spoken came true. So when that happened, right, even though it took some years, really, it is a fulfillment of the promise that God had given to Abraham, right, many years ago, that his people will be a nation and his people will inherit, right, a promised land. Right. And as they settle into the promised land and begin to receive the promise they have for their forefathers, they settle into fertile land, they settle into places they could cultivate and build homes for themselves, right? And towards the end of Joshua's life, right, he challenged the Israelites to make a commitment to live for God. By then, by this time, the Israelites have been living fairly comfortably, right? They have conquered their enemies, right? They have gotten land for themselves, right? And Joshua, before he passed on, felt that it was his responsibilities to challenge the Israelites, right, the leaders, that their relationship with God has to be a conscious choice, right? And this is a very well-known verse that goes like this: then choose today whom you will serve. Would you prefer the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or will it be the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live? But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. So it's quite significant that Joshua, right, for all his life, having lived for and served God, felt the need to make the statement again that, no, me and my household, we will always serve God. And therefore, the leadership, right, the people whom he's speaking to, say, you also must make a choice that you have to live for God, and your children have to make a choice whether they want to live for God or to live for someone else. Right. So as we close up this particular lesson, this particular chart, right, let's look at some key takeaways. One, God is a covenant-keeping God. God is a God who keeps his promises to his people. He's faithful and true to his word. So what has happened to the Israelites is a fulfillment of promises that were spoken to Abraham from years ago. Right. At the same time, the onus is always on mankind to make a choice to serve God. It is significant that when God started to lead Joshua as the new leader, he challenged Joshua to live for him. And as Joshua was getting older and was about to hand over the leadership, he basically challenged his people, saying, now it is time for the next generation to decide to live for God. Right. Okay, so that's all we have for us in this particular chart and lesson. Thank you.